Welcome back, guys. Today's episode, I am sharing 8 true camping horror stories, what lurks beyond the tent at night. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Now, let's begin. Nylon makes a particular sound when you graze it with your knuckles, like a small rain that only you can hear. It's the first thing I notice when I unpack my tent in the apartment, lay it across the living room carpet, and let it billow. The smell blooms up, wet ash that never quite leaves the fabric, the mineral bite of old lake water, and the stubborn ghost of DEET trapped in the seams. I'm doing this indoors because I told myself I would finally talk about the nights I've mostly pretended were ordinary. The truth is, I've put this off for years, and I'm still not sure if saying it out loud is smart or if it gives something shape it didn't have before. Camping made me feel capable when I was younger. It was simple math. Carry the food and shelter, mind the weather, read the map, come back a little lighter and a little proud. Somewhere along the way, I learned a different math, the kind where thin fabric and zippers and the circle of firelight might be the only boundaries you can draw, and you have to believe in them to make them real. I used to call that belief comfort. Now I think of it as a pact. The nylon promises nothing, but I promise not to look when looking would make the line blur. I don't have a hard list of rules written in a notebook, but I have habits I treat like law. I don't whistle after dark. I don't say my name beyond the tent once the fire dies. If something circles, I don't track it with my headlamp. I let the beam stay on my boots and let my ears do the work. I keep one light inside the tent even if there's a lantern outside, and I don't sleep with the zipper fully closed. I leave 3 teeth open so it doesn't remember how to stick. These details sound silly in daylight. They sounded sillier when I tried to explain them to friends. But most of them were born between 2 and 4 a.m. when the air is coldest and small sounds feel larger than your body. There are patterns I can't unsee now that I've recognized them. The steady, measured pacing that never cuts through the campsite, only around it. The precise arrangements left where no hands should have been. Lights that invisibly understand timing. Prints that exist only where the snow should not hold them. Water that moves as if it remembers a person even when no one swims. Everyone who sleeps outside a while collects oddities, the way a jacket picks up burrs. Stories about raccoons with criminal intent or wind that made the tarp a drum. This isn't that. This is the breath you feel on fabric when the night is breathless. This is the zipper that seems to learn, tooth by tooth, how to behave like a lip. I can't prove any of this. That's the other part of the pact. I don't have clear photos. I don't have an answer. What I have are 8 nights I've kept ranked in my head, not by fear exactly, but by how much they rearranged me. 2 bookends. The night I realized the tent and I had an agreement, and the night I understood that agreement had followed me home. I guess this is why I've finally unfolded the tent on my carpet. To make space, to remind my hands that nylon can still be just nylon, and to feel the familiar rasp before I hit play on an audio file I've been avoiding. I named the file by habit, tidy and forgettable, Basin Night 3 M4A. It's been waiting on my phone for months, blinking in that way things do when they want you to pretend you forgot on purpose. I take the phone off airplane mode, plug it into a speaker I don't use for music anymore, and sit on the floor. The tent fills most of the room like a gray-green lung. If all of this is going to leave my head, it needs a beginning. For me, the beginning is the sound, and the sound is the pact. The recording starts with the kind of noise your ears filter in a tent, a thin, steady hush that could be wind or breath, or the far-off conversation of pines moving against themselves. I hear my own sleeping, the soft hitch and settle, the muffled rustle of a bag with a broken baffle. The mic had been left on the little mesh pocket by the door. Accident or insurance, I can't say. The speaker fills my apartment with the old cold. It's strange how a room adopts what you give it. The air in here feels thinner just because my brain expects it to be. At 2 minutes, there's a change so small I only catch it because I've lived with the sound of zippers. It isn't the sliding we all know, the quick staccato run or the careless zip that cuts your knuckle if you hold it wrong. It's 3 teeth lifting in a careful sequence, then setting back. A tick, tick, tick that stops before it can name itself. I pause the file instinctively and then start it again, the way you peel a bandage and stick it back down because your fingers aren't ready. When it comes again, it aligns with what I can only describe as a breath on the other side of fabric, a patient exhale that flattens some part of the nylon so the slider shifts of its own weight. Except sliders don't do that. Not like that. Not in time with lungs. The sound is ordinary if you don't know it. If you do, it makes your body remember its own positions. My feet curl like they're against the thin pad I use. My tongue goes dry the way it does at altitude. The tent in front of me holds the shape of the recording like a mirror. My apartment for a second disappears into cold and the small draft that gets under the fly when the wind can't be bothered. I hear a faint ping, a guy line humming in a register my speaker barely catches, and images start stacking, uninvited. The way a light moved once along a ridge with no road, a circle of stones I didn't build that rose to my waist overnight, a ring of lines in sand that refused to smooth under wind. My head stays with the zipper, though, counting teeth like a child counts steps, hoping numbers will domesticate what numbers never touch. 4.5 minutes. The slider tries again. It moves forward 2 teeth and back 1, like something on the other side is testing how far a ritual can be stretched without breaking it. I do not remember waking that night, not like this. That's what sits wrong. If I had sat up, I would remember the way the bag clung to my shoulders, the gentle panic of finding the headlamp switch in the dark with gloves on. The recording holds none of that, only the careful, repeated probing. There is no wind. There are other night sounds, a distant owl once, a dry grass flicker, my sleep turning over, but nothing that explains intent. I turn the volume down and then back up. I try my headphones. In one ear, closer to where my head was that night, the exhale feels nearer. The fabric makes its soft drumhead sound that taut paper note nylon gets when it's been cold long enough to forget what warmth is. Somewhere upstairs, a neighbor crosses a room. My ceiling ticks. The sound fits perfectly into the silence after. I wait for a voice. I'm embarrassed to admit that. Part of me expects one because names have a way of coming back to you in the woods, sometimes from behind, sometimes from nowhere. Nothing speaks in the recording, just breath and the certainty of fingers you can't prove. I watch the seconds crawl by and can't shake the thought that the tent isn't a house you carry so much as a ritual you draw in thin lines, and something learned how to press against them without stepping through. At 10 minutes, the zipper stops moving entirely. There's a long quiet, so still I can hear my own apartment's fridge compressor start and stop. I lean forward the way you do when you don't want to miss the end of something you can't see. When the noise comes, it's not what I braced for. A soft tap on a stake, the guy line giving a low, glassy note that resolves into nothing. In the tent, that sound means someone stumbled. On the recording, it means the circle was tested and left intact. I pause, swallow a mouthful of water that tastes like dust, and let the silence after the tap sit in the room like a guest I didn't invite. I stop the recording, and the apartment springs back to its real size, which feels smaller. My jaw aches. I'd been holding it shut without meaning to. The tent looks different, though of course it isn't. The fabric is dull in the afternoon light, a soft, forgiving thing compared to the stern, tight skin it becomes in frost. I'm not dizzy and I'm not shaking, but my hands feel imprecise, as if fine work, tying knots, threading a needle, would be impossible for a minute. It's always like that after. There's a lag where your body keeps obeying rules the room doesn't live by. It's tempting to solve it and move on. Thermodynamics, I tell myself. Cold makes things contract. The slack in a line finds its way to the lowest point, and a cheap slider rocked by nocturnal temperature swings can click like thought. Animals nose around. Condensation changes the drag on fabric. Audio compresses and warps. Microphones invent textures out of nothing. Maybe the phone picked up my own breath bouncing off the fly. Maybe I rolled over in my sleep and forgot. I stack the explanations until they wobble, and when they fall, I start again. I'm good at it. I've talked friends through noises in their houses and creaks in their cars. I can make almost anything into bad weather or a loose screw if you give me time. But there's a difference between noises the world makes and gestures. Every time I try to file that recording under weather, it wriggles out. Not because it's dramatic, there's nothing dramatic about it, but because it felt like testing. And if I'm honest, it echoes too cleanly with other nights. Footsteps that kept a respectful circle around the firelight, as if the light itself were a fence. Stacked stones that adopted the tent like sentries while I slept. A ring in a meadow that sang when the wind stopped, leaving a tone in my molars. A voice in fog that knew my name from 2 directions at once. Coordinates on a radio that matched the hill I was on. Lines in sand that went around, and never broke for my boots. The zipper that breathed like someone learning your rhythm to see if you'd give it yours back. This is where the pact lives, in the decision not to help. Not to unzip when something politely fails to unzip for you. Not to answer when a thing learns your outline and tries to put a hand through it. You can call it superstition, you can call it survival. I call it courtesy because courtesy feels less frightened and more agreed upon. And I am sick of carrying these nights like a hole in my pocket where keys keep disappearing. That's why I unfolded the tent in here, why I hit play, why I am telling this instead of cutting the file into a million pieces and pretending it never happened. Telling it isn't breaking the pact. That's what I've decided. Breaking it would be standing up in the dark and matching breath for breath, or unzipping at the first tug and asking, "What?" as if you expect an answer shaped like a person. I kept my side most nights. Where I failed, and I did, was in the morning when the world is soft and you feel brave because coffee is hot and the sun makes ordinary shapes on your hands. Morning is when I investigated, photographed, tried to map the logic of what had happened as if documentation could erase the fact that it happened at all. I don't do that anymore. I used to make a show of cleaning prints, brushing away odd marks, kicking over any thing stacked. Now I leave it be, pack up and go. Maybe that's age, maybe that's respect, maybe it's knowing I won't be believed anyway, and understanding that disbelief is part of what kept me safe. So this is my courtesy given back. 8 nights, told plain. No gore, no monster I can point to. Just the thin places and the small decisions that made those places thinner or kept them intact. If you camp, some of this will just sound like nerves. That's fine. If you don't, think of it the way you think of waking in your house at 3 a.m. to a sound you can't quite place. A cupboard sighing open, a drawer sliding slowly back into itself, and knowing somehow the right response is to go still and not to call out. I will start at the beginning of the 8, at the night a zipper learned how to breathe, and then walk forward. What happens after the lantern dies is quieter than you expect, and I can't promise it gets resolved. I can only promise I'll keep the pact here too. I won't embellish. I won't look when looking only makes the line blur. We took the old blazed line because it was the kind of choice we made back then. My brother liked the romance of the past, and I liked the quiet that came with being off the main trail. The map in his hand was creased in the way paper remembers thumbs. The inked route had faded to a gray vein across green contour. Late shoulder season, just cold enough for our breath to be interesting, just warm enough that the creek still spoke in water and not ice. Laurel and rhododendron had made tunnels over the path, their leaves stiff and dusty with the long summer, the sort of green that looks tired in low light. We found a flat bench above a horseshoe bend where the creek turned back on itself and made a sound like a slow saw. We set the tent on that bench as if placing a coin on a table. Centered, correct, as if correctness mattered to anything but us. He hung the bear bag because he had the reach and a throw that still made me jealous. I knelt by the water and squeezed it through the filter until my hands went numb. A barred owl called somewhere. A bridge. One of those calls that's so close to speech your brain leans forward. The air smelled like leaf rot and old charcoal, the way the floor under a campfire smells after rain. We ate quickly, the kind of food that makes heat more than it makes flavor. My brother made a joke about the tent's zipper sticking. This thing is going to betray us someday. And I laughed because that was the sort of thing we said to make a myth out of minor annoyances. He pulled the slider down and up a few times to prove the point, the little teeth singing their metal syllables in the cold. We didn't have rules yet. Not the rules I live by now. Back then, the talk after dark still felt like talk. We said each other's names without thinking. We whistled to call one another from 20 yards away when one of us went to the creek. We used the headlamps like lighthouses, raking the black with bright cones because it was fun to make the woods look like a stage. If there were patterns waiting out there, we weren't trained to see them, or we were, and we were good at pretending we weren't. The fire crimped down surprisingly fast, a last flare, and then the quiet that comes after your eyes readjust. I remember the moment the cold found my ankles through the thin fabric of my hiking pants, as if the night had waited for our voices to drop. We zipped ourselves in, that careful threading of 2 people in a space designed for 1.5. He took the side by the door because he always took the practical side. I tucked my hat down over my ears and listened to the creek establish the background. The nylon above us sagged and then tightened as the temperature slipped, and the condensation formed and rolled in slow beads, their paths intersecting like shy insects. In that mild, wet mix of creek and leaf, I fell asleep believing the tent to be what it always felt like. A thin idea that somehow worked. Because we wanted it to. What I remember about the moment before it shifted is small. My brother's breath even and polite, my shoulder dull where the pad thinned, that far-barred owl mapping the hollow with its question again. I didn't know it then, but this was the night that would give me the shape of the pact I live by now. The sense that the fabric keeps its promise only when you keep yours. Sometime between the last owl call and the first flirt of dawn, the tent learned to have a mouth. That's what it felt like. The door zipper took on the softness of a lip, and the teeth auditioned for speech. I woke into the tail end of a breath I didn't think was mine. Longer, lower, close enough that the fabric over my face cooled. There was a sound then, too quiet to be theatrical, exactly the size of a mosquito landing. Tick, tick, tick. If you've lived with zippers, you know that sound. It's the slider lifting along the teeth just enough to test, not enough to travel. My body did its own old math. Go still, make yourself blank, let your ears take the work your eyes would ruin. I knew where the headlamp lived by my hand. I did not reach for it. My brother's breathing held steady for a few counts and then hitched the way it does when you register something in sleep without wanting to. He didn't move. I didn't either. The creak kept sawing itself in place, unconcerned. The zipper tested again. Tiny motion. 2 teeth forward this time, 1 back, metal apologizing to metal. I felt the faint pull through the floor of the tent, a pressure you only catch when it's anchored to your other senses. And then, from exactly where the pull had come, my brother's voice said, calm as any midnight question, "You going out?" The part of my brain that keeps the files on people I love opened immediately. He says that sometimes when I shift in my bag, like he's offering to walk with me to the tree line. He says it without a punctuation, just like that, no urgency. But he was beside me, warm, predictable. The "you" came from the wrong side of the nylon. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a funny angle of sound. It was him with the tiny lilt he has on the word out, and it was not where he was. I kept my mouth closed, a habit I didn't know I had yet. Something outside waited in the way people wait when they expect conversation. My tongue found the dry seam of my teeth. I thought about animals. Foxes make sounds that fool you. Owls talk like arguments in another room. People can be out there. Even here, off the old blazed line, an old road could lead to a lost hiker or a bored teenager. I pushed the reasonable explanations in front of me like a shield, thin as a dish towel. After a long 5 breaths, the zipper clicked twice more, tentative. My brother moved, just a small shift, the sound of nylon whispering against nylon. And then, almost like a delayed echo from inside our wall, his own real voice, raw with sleep, said into his bag, "You going out?" The exact same cadence, as if this time he was the reflection and the other had been first. I felt the heat climb my throat in a way that didn't belong to temperature. The little hairs on my forearms prickled under the base layer. I couldn't tell if he was parroting a dream or answering something I couldn't see. He didn't reach for the zipper, neither did I. The outside waited a couple more breaths, this close patience that made my stomach tighten like a seatbelt, and then let out a longer exhale, flattening the door against the shape of a nose or a cheek. The nylon sounded like paper against a glass pane. Somewhere to our left, in the laurel, a foot, or the idea of one, placed and lifted without hurry. It took a slow step, then another, circling but not approaching, the way you test a fence to learn where the gate is. The guy line on the creekside gave a single quiet twang. A stake ticked. No hand touched the poles. No shadow fell because there wasn't enough light to make one. It took a minute, maybe more, for the sensation that the door was being watched to ease. My body did small math again. Count to 20, then to 25. Separate breath from the creek's breath. When the creek slipped back into being the largest thing I could hear, I let some of the held air go. My brother's breathing settled into the version I know from when he's forcing himself to seem asleep. We never unzipped. The slider stayed where it had learned to balance, 3 teeth forward of where it had been when we slept. The night resumed like a radio station you'd turned down and then forgot to turn back up. I waited for morning the way you hold on to a rope that looks decorative and turns out to be load-bearing. Morning in those woods comes in pale grays, a slow finding of edges before color politely returns. The creek sounded less like an idea and more like water again. The tent had been painted with beads of condensation, and they slipped free when I flicked the fabric with a knuckle. It took a beat to realize the slider on the door wasn't where it should have been. Not far, just an odd, fussy half-inch forward, stopped mid-line. The tab turned in a direction I would never leave it. It felt like seeing your chair moved when you enter a room. Not different enough to prove, different enough to be true. "Did you go out?" he asked, as if the extra teeth had been a weather report we'd both heard. He said it calm, but he didn't look at me when he said it, and he never buried questions in casual like that unless he was trying not to feed them. "No," I said. "I thought you did." Or, "I thought you asked if I was." He made a face I've seen on him since we were kids. That irritated focus, something like someone doing a math problem and finding a letter in it. "I heard you ask me," he said, from the door. He pointed exactly where I'd felt the exhale flatten the fabric. His eyes cut to the zipper. We leave it like that? I shook my head. The creak continued being real. Birds tried out mourning on the other side of the laurel. We opened the door together slowly, like we were trying not to make a joke of it by being careful. Outside, the world had the small, honest mess that camping leaves, ash gone gray in the ring, our boot prints softened by dew, the bare line taut and only our knots in it. No other prints. The laurel leaves held water in their cuffs where they joined the twig. A spider had strung a new crosshatch high between stems. The guy line that had twanged wore a single long hair of moss like a thread, not broken, not new. We tried on explanations because that's what you do. My brother suggested a deer nosed the fabric. I pointed out the angle didn't make sense for breath at the zipper. He said owls say your name and you hear what you want. I said I heard him, and he said he heard me, and we both found that too neat. We mentioned foxes and people and sleep-talking, each like a card you throw down knowing it won't win the hand. I didn't mention the way the cadence matched him, exact timbre, the small smile he puts into questions even when he's tired. He didn't mention that the door had shifted from the outside, because that's just a collection of unlikely physics until you admit it isn't. I touched the slider with a thumb and it felt cold in a way metal keeps, even in modest weather. Later at home I would spend a dumb half hour seeing if I could move a zipper 3 teeth and back with just breath. You can't. You can fog it. You can warm it. But without fingers, without intention, it stays polite. It's silly to say this, but it mattered when my test failed. It made a small door open in my head where the rule would live. Leave a few teeth open by choice so the zipper doesn't learn you're trying to keep it shut. Calling it a rule was easier than saying, so it feels like you saw it and agreed. We packed unreasonably quickly for who we were then, which tells me we didn't buy our own cards. We didn't sprint. We're not the sprinting kind. But we kept conversation thin. The woods felt crowded in places they shouldn't. On the climb out, a gust bent the laurel, and for a second the leaves rasped together in a way that made my skin remember the door's breath. A mile up, the trail met an old logging road. An iron sign lay face down in the ferns, brown with a kind of rust that smells like pennies. My brother flipped it and found it blank on both sides, which made us laugh for real, and that laughter brought us back to ordinary. A mile from the car, he said, "You really didn't go out?" In the way he asked the same question when he's hoping repetition will change the answer. I said no, again. There was a long moment where I thought he might say, "Then what was it?" But he didn't. He said nothing, and we walked, and it felt appropriate, as if saying it would turn the wrong kind of attention our direction. We never touched the story for a while. We let it sit in that shared drawer siblings keep for things that are true, but not useful to press. At home, I tried to make it small. Hypnagogia, the brain's habit of building narrative from noise when you're near sleep. Barred owls throwing voices. Condensation in a line that changed drag on the teeth. Maybe one of us talked in sleep and the other dreamed the source. Maybe the slider had been left off by us and the morning made it look like intent. I could get almost all the way there. Then I'd hear my brother's voice from the wrong side of that nylon again. Just those 3 words. And the almost would pull back like a tide leaving a sharp shelf. That night wasn't dramatic. We didn't see anything. Nobody bled. If it was a person, they never did more than breathe and try a zipper they didn't take. If it was an animal, it leer. Learned a human question well enough to ask it in the right voice. I don't know which unsettles me more. What I do know is that it gave me Rule 1 and Rule 2 without me naming them. Don't help and don't give your name to the dark, no matter who asks. I didn't call out then. I didn't unzip. I kept the thin idea intact, and it kept me. I wish I could pretend it was only that once, but if it were, I wouldn't be telling you any of this. The place was a dry bowl off a 2-track that had given up on being a road. A map from the glove compartment said Black Ridge in tiny type, but not in the way a place is named, more like someone labeling a color on a drawing. The topo lines tightened to a thin smile on the horizon, and everything between me and that grin was scrub and scattered rock, pale and powder dry. Creosote, rabbit brush, sage, scrub that smells like sun-baked medicine when your boots bruise it. A wash cut the bowl like a crease you could lose a hand in. The notion was to car camp for once, not to be brave. Sleep with the tent a respectful distance from the hatch. Keep a cooler and a real pillow. Let the sky do the work. New moon, no wind forecasted, and nothing human on the nearest satellite layer but the thin white vein of the highway 30 miles away. I got there during the gold hour that makes even junk look like relics. A rusted barrel half sunken in the sand had a bullet pucker on one side. Old glass shards flexed a last bit of color at the arroyo's curve. Juniper islands shaped the wind when there was wind. This evening the air lay down and stayed. Silence in the desert isn't an absence, it's a pressure. The way your ears pop when you go over a pass, then realize they won't. You can hear your breath deciding what to do with itself. That kind of quiet always starts out as a gift. Later it feels like being listened to. I did the small rituals that make a space. Behave. I pitched the tent with its back to a low berm like it wanted the hill's hand on its shoulder. I left the zipper with 3 teeth open because that had become habit, not exactly superstition. But I can't call it anything else. I set a low lamp inside, switched to the dimmest warm setting, and kept the headlamp around my neck where the elastic keeps a bit of that old campfire smell no matter how much you wash it. I didn't whistle. I didn't say my name out loud. Out here, sound travels too well. It might get ideas. Dusk poured itself into the wash and then into the bowl, and the temperature slid down the kind of gradient your skin reads like Braille. Coyote started a channel far off, then decided it wasn't worth the effort and cut it. I ate out of a pan without pretending to cook. It tasted like metal and heat, and that slight dust the desert settles on everything. Above the ridge, the first stars came in shy and then crowded. The desert version of leaves on a tree, so dense your brain makes patterns whether it wants to or not. That's when I noticed, just at the edge of the ridgeline, a smear of orange as if someone had struck a match in a bottle and then put their palm over the mouth. I told myself it was a star low enough to shimmer against air layers. Stars do that near the horizon. They jitter and tug colors out of themselves like a trick. But the smear pulled itself into a bead, and then a second appeared a thumb width to the right, and they held still in a way that stars don't. I didn't stand. I didn't sweep my headlamp at them. You learn quick out here that light is a kind of question. Sometimes the desert thinks it owes you an answer. I did run the old habit of roads through my head. Could there be a jeep track up there that the map didn't catch? Ranchers use everything. Miners, too. The angle was wrong for a road cut, though. A steep, broken seam that looked like a pile of plates leaned against one another. I couldn't picture a vehicle up there without the whole thing giving way. Plates tumbling, headlights flipping end over end. I convinced myself the lights were more sky than ground. Then a third one bridged the gap, and all 3 sat on the ridge like punctuation. I let the desert do its silence. My tongue felt thick. The headlamp at my throat had a mode I almost never used. 3 short pulses to save battery, a dumb novelty. I brushed the button by accident, checking the battery indicator, and the headlamp answered me with 3 quick blinks into my own chest. I winced, tipped the beam down to my boots, and told myself I'd only spoken to my belt buckle and not to the ridge. Then, up there, the 3 beads answered in kind. Dim, brighter, dim, like someone cupping, then opening, then cupping a hand over a lantern. If I'd planned it, maybe it would feel different. If I'd done the campfire boy thing and signaled on purpose, if I'd raised my lamp and started counting like I was 10 and wanted the night to clap back, I could blame me. But it was an accidental triple blink at my own shirt, and the ridge did it back. The shape they made wasn't a convoy. I grew up near enough to ranches and oil fields to know the way trucks climb a grade. Headlights bump, separate, throw shadows between them. You can almost hear the diesel if you're paying attention. This was smooth, like magnets running a track under glass. The 3 points slid along the ridge like a sentence rephrasing itself. When one paused, the other 2 adjusted to keep what my brain decided was a spacing, but it wasn't proportional to the terrain. Rocks that should have interrupted them did nothing. I couldn't map their behavior to the shape of anything I knew. The rule in me about light wanting answers made my hands heavy. I left the headlamp aimed at my boots as if I could apologize to the ground. The lamp's halo threw out enough to make the immediate ring honest. Stove, bag, water jug, the little trash bag folded into itself like a white flower. Just beyond that circle, the scrub thickened, dark as a crowd that didn't want the stage but didn't want to leave either. A pebble somewhere to my right clicked against another pebble with the kind of precise energy a foot puts into ground. Deliberate, small, with weight behind it. Something paced. Not aimlessly, not hunting. It felt like someone using the dark the way a person uses a wall phone, the coiled cord acting as a leash. Step, settle, wait. Step, settle, wait. On the ridge, the beads drifted left as a unit, and then the leftmost broke formation and dropped a fraction, which shouldn't have been possible unless the ridge had a second lip invisible from where I sat. It went down, and the others, with the kind of politeness that's worse than rudeness, made room. I don't know how I know that. Made room. But that's how it felt, as if there was an etiquette of spacing in play, and my brain recognized it before I had words for why. I told myself it was aircraft, a training run low enough to trick the eye. Except there was no sound. The desert catches engines even from far off. It puts them in your ribs like a coin your body can't swallow. This put nothing in me but attention, and the timing. Every time I shifted myself, sat forward or leaned back, the beads seemed to press their paws for the exact length it took me to commit to the movement. I wanted to call it coincidence. It felt like conversation. Maybe the worst thing I did was test the test back. I lifted my chin just enough to throw the headlamp's edge out past my boots without sweeping it like a search. The beam brushed the nearest scrub, painted juniper a color it doesn't like, and trembled on the stones. And then I counted in my head without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, and the lights above me split. One held, two shifted, then the third slipped to join the second, like a hand signal passed down a line. Behind me, sand shoaled against sand. The tiny catch and slide on the back of your teeth you never think about until... You are listening too hard failed. I swallowed nothing. The old rule reminded me. Don't turn. Don't give anything the eye contact it thinks it earned. I kept my face at my boots and tried to watch the horizon without looking at it. That's a ridiculous sentence, but it's what I did. The thing in the scrub kept its circle the way the creek thing had kept its. It tracked a path just outside the lamp's edge. Every time the beads stopped, the steps stopped. When the beads resumed, the steps made up the distance on the other side, politely staying out where the dark begins. I thought of radio towers, of flare tests, of someone out of sight with a drone. But drones whine unless the wind steals the sound, and there was no wind. The plaid of the sky went all the way to the horizon, uninterrupted. The wash down to my left kept a cold like a root cellar. The metal cup by the stove sang one high, almost unheard note when the air cooled, then closed its mouth and stayed. I wanted to call out. Not hello, nothing so dumb. Just a plain question in a plain tone. You see me? But that's exactly the kind of thing that makes patterns take hold of you. I let my hands rest on my knees. I counted breath in fours. Above, the beads drew a thin curve, then stopped together as if what we had been doing had reached its end. What came next was quieter. No answering blinks. No movement on the ridge. In the scrub, the pacing finished its loop at the wash, waited, and then took 3 steps away. So soft the only proof was the small collapse of the attention I'd been holding. It left like someone hanging up a phone. Dawn revealed how flat secrets look under daylight. The ridge was what it had been on the map. A black seam of basalt and shattered caliche, sloughs of rock that should absolutely not hold tires. I climbed part way, following the long diagonal of goat trails that stitched the slope of Musa, and then vanished where it turned to plates. Up close, the space where the beads had hovered turned out to be nothing in particular. No ledge, hidden by angle, no path carved into the face, no scraped rubber, no tracks. The only human leavings I found were lower. A blue shard of bottle glass with edges ground opal smooth. A faded cartridge casing so old the stamp was a suggestion. I stood there longer than I needed to, because I wanted the ridge to tell on itself. It didn't. Back at camp, the ring of my night looked like someone had laid out evidence of ordinary. Cup, stove, tent, jug, dust. My footprints were an argument in every direction from the car to the wash and back. Nothing else had punctuated them. No cat pads. No little two-toed prints a deer would leave, which would have made sense of the pacing, or at least given me something to hold. The scrub had dropped a few brittle seeds in the hours we slept, but the ground kept secrets like it had been taught. I don't know what I expected. Crescent moon imprints from shoes that never scuffed, an apology written in stone. I broke the camp with that alertness you try to call focus when it's really disbelief gnawing through fatigue. Every sound asked to be about last night. The zipper wanted me to see it as a mouth again. The cooler latching shut pretended to be a far-off engine. The hawk somewhere high coughed a cry that looked like light. Even my tongue felt suspect, the taste of dust and old coffee turning into metallic excuses. I set the headlamp aside like a tool I didn't trust around electricity and told myself not to make patterns into people. Rationalizing is a programming language I speak fluently. I tried every dialect. Fata Morgana. Superior mirage warping lights from the highway up to the ridge in stacked layers, making them climb and pause and adjust. I wrote it down in my head like a neat answer to a test, but Fata Morgana distorts, smears. It doesn't coordinate. Maybe it was a convoy on ranch land I didn't know about, trucks moving. With discipline, the sound lost to temperature layers, to distance lying. I looked at the ridge again and imagined someone I couldn't see standing there, cupping and uncapping a lantern in an old kind of code generations forgot. That didn't help. Drones, then. Some hobbyist out here with money and too much time, messing with a stranger for sport. I listened for the mosquito whine I hadn't heard and inserted it retroactively into the memory like a patch. It didn't hold. The pacing, too, wanted help. Pack rats collect shiny things and make a racket. Javelina move in lines that break then reform. Coyotes test circles like kids test fences, never touching. Tying the steps to any of them would have eased that tightness under the sternum. But the timing, the way the steps placed and lifted when the beads did, it was a rhythm, and rhythm is intent, and intent is where my problem lives. When you catch a beat, when your foot taps because it's invited, you've already agreed to a kind of dance. I didn't record it. That's what people want to know when I tell this story. No video, no boomerang of lights, no audio of shoes in sand. Maybe that's convenient. Maybe it's proof of courtesy. I don't try to trap things anymore. I paid once for the evidence of a zipper breathing, and all it bought me was a new room in my head where quiet makes a ticking I can't unhear. Driving out, the two-track felt more civilized than it had coming in. The desert does that when it is done with you. At the highway, the cell signal grabbed hold of the car with both hands and shook its pockets out. Messages, voicemails, a nudge from an app with a name I've never said out loud in the desert. I almost searched for Black Ridge lights, the kind of confirmation you pretend you don't need. I didn't. Every time I've looked for corroboration, what I've found was worse than being alone. Tourist videos with commentaries. That makes a joke of it, grainy frames full of lens flares presented as proof, passwords to clubs I don't want to join. The rule that came out of Black Ridge is small and, for me, iron. Don't initiate patterns you don't want mirrored. Light is a question, rhythm is a door. If you must use either, make them about your own hands, your own boots, and keep them inside the circle you've drawn. That night was the first time I felt the desert answer a thing I hadn't meant to ask. Since then, when my thumb finds the headlamp's button, I take my hand off like it's a hot pan. I let the stars do what they've done without me for every night I wasn't there. And if something up on a ridge wants to punctuate the horizon, I let it make its sentence without me in it. I can live with not knowing. I've made a practice of it. What I haven't learned how to stop is the little tilt my attention makes now when I see a line of headlights on a hill outside town, or a string of porch lights along a lake's far shore, or lightning bugs staging their patient drama in a tree line. Some part of me leans forward and waits for the pause that matches my breath. When the lights keep being what they are, trucks, houses, insects, I feel relief and a sliver of grief I can't justify. The night on Black Ridge is still out there someplace, continuing without me, answering questions I didn't ask, and pacing around a circle I left behind. I kept the pact. I didn't sweep the beam. I didn't call to it. The desert answered anyway, and if there's anything like a moral here, it's that silence isn't the same as no one listening. Alpine cold has edges. It doesn't just lower temperature. It files the night into shapes your body feels from the inside out. By the time we broke above the trees into the basin, the air had turned to a dry sting that made my nose burn and my own breath feel unfamiliar. The headlamps went off because the sky could handle it. Late light slid off the corniced ridge in a thin layer like fish scales, and the snow too. That light the way paper takes pencil. My friend Lena shuffled a glove off with her teeth and shook pins of ice out of her lashes. We'd come up on snowshoes along a gully that stepped like a staircase. Our tracks stitched together neat across a powder face that had gone untouched since the last storm. It felt rude almost to write on something that had held its blank so hard. The basin was smaller than maps make them, an oval crater with its own weather, rimmed by cornice and fluted slopes. The floor was a flat that tilted just enough toward the outlet to make your shovel work count. We cut a platform with the little aluminum blades, the snow squeaking a styrofoam soprano. The sound is specific, sharp, dry, a promise of cold that's not going anywhere. When I stomped a test step, the crust went hollow and then set. No whump, no settlement crack racing away, the kind of snow that makes you think you know it. We oriented the tent with its back to the prevailing wind and the door a little off true north. Habit, nothing but habit. I left the zipper 3 teeth shy of closed as we always did. The rule felt silly until it didn't. We built a low wind wall more to give our hands something to do than because the forecast called for it. Lena was practical like that. She never let her brain talk her out of the small rituals. Pee bottle within reach, shovel inside by the door, headlamps on red to not ruin night eyes, stove fuel warmed in an inside pocket so it wouldn't sputter when we needed it. I could smell white gas the second the bottle opened, that chemical hit that overrides every mountain smell and puts you in basements and garages and winter projects with your father. The stove roared to life and then settled into a cat's purr. Steam billowed into the vestibule and immediately rhymed the fabric with sugar. We didn't whistle after dark. We didn't say names outside once that does. E-stove went out. It's not like we had a written list, but by then the pact had taken root enough that we touched it without naming it. The basin felt like a bowl you whisper over. Sound carried in odd ways. Lena's zipper tug inside the tent came back from the cornice with the lag of a small echo chamber. A raven cast its black right over our heads, croaked once like a cough, and vanished beyond the rim, and the quiet that followed wasn't absence, it was attention. Our tracks to the tent made two clean lines like stitches in pale skin. Later those lines would matter more than the tent did. For now they were just proof of our existence, two simple pieces of arithmetic across a white page. Came in here, stood here, set home here. I remember, as we pulled the last guy line tight, feeling a small, unwarranted relief at seeing our tracks laid clean. When you camp in winter, tracks are your ledger. They tell you you're not alone only when you want to know. They also do the opposite. We ate crouched in the vestibule, hunched shoulders in. Pasta became heat without becoming food. I can still feel the way the spoon stuck to my lip when I got impatient and didn't let it cool. The moon floated up without ceremony and made the basin a negative, shadows inked in a softer black. I crawled in, let the sound of the stove wind down, sealed my bag up to the mouth. The condensation on the inside of the fly grew into a universe of frost, and every breath I took made stars. I fell asleep counting guy line hums when the wind touched them, scraping a nail along their tautness and letting them sing low glass notes. The tent was a room of our own making and, as always, false in a way that still works if you pretend hard enough. What stands out in memory isn't a big thing. It's the moment I lay there in the blue of early dark and thought, the snow will remember us exactly as we were, and the way the thought made me feel satisfied, the way it felt like security instead of an invitation. Sometime around the coldest hour, when Hier can't bear the idea of being warmer even for an instant, the tent made the sugar sand hiss of spindrift against tight nylon. It's a small, persistent whisper, like someone quietly testing paper with a fingernail. I woke, didn't move. Watched the moonlight travel the tiniest hand's breadth down the mesh. The wind wasn't strong. It only made the guy line hum every few minutes. The basin held its shape around us. A single sound then, the precise, compact compression of snow under weight. Not the collapse you get when a small drift slumps, not the creak of frost shifting in a seam. A footstep, 10 feet away maybe. Then nothing, the kind of nothing that notices you back. We stayed inside. It was not even a decision. The pact sometimes feels like a set of rules someone else made and you just inherited with the tent. I counted out a long minute. Longer. Lena's breathing found its way back to steady. When I finally took my glove off around 2 a.m. to adjust the hood cord, the air bit each knuckle like a series of small enemies, and I pulled the glove on with my teeth like a dog, careful not to thump the wall in case the snow out there had ears. The sugar hiss came and went. There was no more footstep. My brain built and unbuilt explanations until dawn began to hint at itself. Morning in a basin like that doesn't so much arrive as reveal. The blue lifts out of the snow in thin layers, gray decides to be white, and then everything has edges. I unzipped the vestibule the 3 teeth I hadn't given it, and the zipper slid with that satisfied tone it gets in cold. Breath plumed out and back in like I was a chimney. For a second, all I noticed was brightness, the kind that makes your eyes water before your mind decides it's crying. Then Lena said, quiet and flat, "Do you see that?" And all the light in my chest seemed to drop into my stomach. Our tracks from yesterday were right where we left them. 2 clean lines from the gully to the tent, a small trampled area around the platform, a few careful steps to the wind wall and back. Between them, not on top of ours, not crossing them, a third set ran like a script written by someone who didn't understand paper. It threaded the narrow strip between our lines in places where there was no room for a body, then evaporated for 6, 8, 10 strides, and resumed on the far side of our approach, as if someone had stepped over us without making the crossing. I have looked at a lot of tracks. Dog, fox, hare, cat, coyote, human, snowshoe. These were wrong even before shape. The spacing was a human stride and then not. Long, long, short, pause, long. As if the ground itself sometimes didn't exist and then did. Depth betrayed it more than anything. Shallow on the soft powder we'd expected to swallow a leg. Punched deep where wind crust should have carried weight. In one section, a print sat on top of a thin lace of spindrift that had blown overnight. In the next, a similar print was under that lace, which would mean it had existed before the wind, only if the wind had been selective. We moved in slow, careful circles as if you can be polite to traces. I measured with a ski pole. My hand shook and I told myself it was cold. The impressions were almost oval, a boot suggestion without tread. No splay, no claw punctures, no toe register. Not the doubled front hind of a fox's direct register, not the offset of a cat, not the picket fence of hair, not the flap and punch of snowshoe tails. The line came from nowhere, approached the vestibule like a question, and ended there with both last prints pointing in, as neat as someone stopping at a doorway. No scuff, as if someone knelt, no marks from a hand, just two clean, shallow shapes at the tent's edge, and then nothing. No exit pay. Ethelina crouched and held a mitten over one like she was warming it back up. "Wine thing," she said low, like we could both make it so. "Venturi, spindrift carving negative space." "The spacing," I said. "Look at the spacing." "Or," she said, "because we do this for each other. Teenagers on skis at 2 a.m. playing some dumb game." "Then where did they cross ours?" I heard the small bite in my own voice and dialed it down. I pressed my glove into snow to feel how the crust took weight. It wasn't there. Then it was. The print that had arrived under the spindrift had hard lips of older cold, the sort you can see when you cut a pit, the layers of a storm recorded like tree rings. The one above the lace had fuzzed edges already, as if it exhaled into the day. We followed the line only far enough to see it making no sense was the sense. It stepped near an exposed rock that had slurped sun and should have softened the snow around it, and left a deeper mark in the place I could stand on without a dent. It bridged a drainage without breaking the paper-thin veils formed overnight. Then, mid-basin, the print simply stopped, like a sentence abandoned. 10, 12 strides later, they began again as if a page had been lifted and replaced. When we came back to the tent, the last two at the vestibule still faced in, patient as a pair of shoes waiting to be stepped into. I tried to imagine them as ours, a trick of angle, a softness where we'd kneeled last night without knowing it. The math refused. The basin felt narrower, like the rim had leaned in to eavesdrop. The stove sputtered when it met cold metal, coughed to life, and the roar was the first sound I trusted that day. If you've ever spent a full day trying to unsee something that doesn't fit the machine you use to sort the world, you know the exhaustion before you've even moved. We made coffee that tasted like metal and Vicks and Tory in equal parts. We sat with the vestibule unzipped, mugs in hand, steam freezing our upper lips, and we did the considerate argument we're good at. Lena offered wind and melt and sublimation, and the way cold eats edges until it gives an impression, a new history. I offered the shame I keep close, that sometimes I come out here half hoping to brush up against something not catalogued, and that maybe hope wears a shape if you let it. We gave each other the ridiculous ones, too, so the reasonable could take a breath. Sleepwalkers, pranksters, a cat in boots, a hallucination graduated to two people at once. We laughed once at that, grateful for the nth degree where panic lets you put your tongue out at it. Practicality demanded a second night. The forecast gave us clear, the avalanche report had been kind, and breaking camp to chase an answer we couldn't catch felt like letting the basin tell us how to behave. We built the wind wall higher. We ran a spare guy line around the tent a foot out, a loop we told ourselves was for spindrift, to catch it before it filled the vestibule. Really, it was a trip line of sorts, a string with 3 empty tins hung from it that would rattle if something brushed them. Childish and probably loud if the wind chose to care. The wind did not. We lay down rules out loud the way you do around children. We won't exit the tent after dark. We will not say each other's names outside. If we have to go, we use the bottle. We do not talk to anything that isn't wearing our faces. That evening, the sun moved its cold arc and left. The basin went lavender, then cobalt, then something so blue it reads black. The world simplified to line and shine. The guy line hummed once, twice, like a tuning fork. A hush set in that made you hear your own swallowing. Somewhere on the rim, cornice peeled off with a soft, long sigh and settled on its own terms. Around midnight, the sugar hiss returned, small and patient. At some point, with my eyes open in the dark, I felt, not heard, felt, the density change at the door. No tea breath, not heat. More like standing near a window and knowing someone is on the other side because of how your skin calibrates itself. I let all my muscles try on the shape of stillness. The tins did not rattle. There was no zipper test this time. The basin didn't do theater. It did what it had done. It learned our outline and left us a choice not to learn back. I slept in pieces. I dreamed in literal white, blank paper that insisted it had text if I only stood at the right angle. This is the part where I tell you the dream gave me a map and we woke and followed it. No, we woke to the kind of brightness that hurts, put gloves on to open the door, and found that the third set had come back. It had circled the tent at the distance where our string hung, each print angled slightly inward as if addressing us. It had not touched the string. Near the vestibule, the last two prints lay where they had yesterday, not exactly the same, edges softer, depth more honest to the warmer morning, but occupying the same idea. A farther arc of prints drifted off toward the outlet and then lost themselves to glare. They did not cross ours. In two places where our own tracks had filled in a little with blown snow, the new prints sat under that fill in a way that shouldn't be possible, unless the night had decided to rearrange the order of events. We packed like people who had somewhere to be. It wasn't panic. It was efficiency, taken to the point of devotion. We didn't stomp the third set flat. We didn't photograph them. If you're thinking, how inconvenient, I know. I have the recording of a zipper breathing, and all it bought was more night inside my house. I have learned to let the snow keep its secrets in mine. We pulled the stakes with fingers that had lost their fine motor. We said little. When we cut across our own approach, I wanted more than anything to backtrack to keep our leaving on top of our arriving so there'd be no new math for anyone to do. We didn't. We gave the basin its ledger and went. Driving home, I picked spindrift out of my hair at a red light, found a shard of ice in the crook of my neck where it had hidden all morning. The city wore a gray slush the color of cold coffee. On a patched sidewalk near my building, a child had stamped a line of boot prints from a curb to a snowbank, then across to a stoop. Between those, where no one had bothered to walk, the wind had drawn little parentheses. I stared too long, body bracing for pattern, before I let myself label them as just wind's handwriting. The rule that's set from that basin is one I can't always keep, but try. Don't make your camp the only writing on a page if you can help it. Leave your lines messy, your circles broken. Snow remembers too perfectly, and sometimes it writes back. When I'm forced to winter camp on a blank, I'll drag a stick and a rude ring around the tent, a circle so obvious and ragged it offends whatever wants neat geometry. Maybe that does nothing. Maybe it's a way to tell myself I participated in the pact, that I didn't present a perfect blank for something to annotate. I can live without knowing what walked where it couldn't have walked. I can live with the story of wind and layered snow and our own sleepy minds making rituals into evidence. What lives with me and is harder is the feeling of those last two prints at the vestibule, the courtesy of someone stopping at a door. It's a shape that has stepped into other winters since. A line of salt crust on the floor outside my apartment in February ending at my doormat. Scuffs on a hallway tile that start and stop like thought. The third set taught me that answers aren't the point of most nights. The pact is, you keep it because you said you would, and the fabric and the snow and whatever else is listening, keep theirs just enough that you can come home and try not to look for patterns where you told yourself you wouldn't. It found, as the smallest island on that chain, more of a pause in the lake than a place. A rounded plate of granite the size of a basketball court, with a handful of old red pines leaning into each other like elders swapping weather. The map I carried didn't bother to name it. The contour lines lost interest at the shoreline and left the rock to invent itself. Early September had stripped the buzz from the mosquitoes, and the days were warm enough to trick you into liking the water. But the lake was northern and deep and wore its cold to the skin. I dipped my hand to test it at the landing and recoiled. A metallic bite, the kind of cold that closes over your wrist like a mouth. It took 2 short portages and a long paddle to get there. The wind died as I crossed a narrowing, and the canoe cut its own path through a black mirror that made every move theatrical. When I drew the paddle in, the drips from the blade made stipple patterns like handwriting that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Loons worked the far reach, and one dove so long I started counting in my head and stopped when it felt like hubris. The smell of the place was a layered memory. Pine resin, cold iron water, leaf duff gone tea-brown under the pines. On the granite, lichen wrote slow cursive in whites and pale greens, and old fire scars made dark halos where someone had burned too hot years back. I set my pack on the high side, and the island answered with its hollow timbre, a careful, ringing sort of silence that remembers every footstep. I beached the canoe only enough to unload, habit, and then pushed it back to float where the rock shelved off. I tied the painter to a gnarled root and let 8 feet of line lie slack so the hull wouldn't grind. I've learned that water turns anything tight into an instrument, and I didn't want to pluck a string the lake could also pluck. The tent went up on the flattest ledge, back to wind that wasn't likely to return. The zipper, out of reflex, I left with 3 teeth open. A small lamp glowed inside, dim and warm, the way you leave a light on in a hallway for a child who isn't coming home that night. The fire ring I found was a neat circle of stones with the kind of glassy chunks you get when someone burns cans. I rebuilt it wider and lower, more respectful to the rock. The island had a path that wasn't a path. The high lip wore smooth where waves had licked it forever, and the pines kept their lowest branches broken from years of people making the same choices. I walked the ring once, just once, to see what my night would be. The water lay down around every bend, until it didn't. At the north tip, the bottom fell away under the rock like a color change. My stomach registered the drop, as if my body could feel depth from above. You'd need a rope here if you fell in. You wouldn't have time for one. I made dinner without pretense, the kind you eat because fire makes food into consent. The lake took the day's last heat and showed no seam where sky begins. A loon laughed once, unkind in the way it sometimes is, a sound that makes a city part of you look around for neighbors you don't have. After I cleaned the pan, I sat on the granite where it sloped to the water and watched the not-quite fire in the coals. I didn't whistle. I didn't say my name. The island felt like a room with a listener, a circle drawn inside a larger circle I couldn't see. If there is a rule for islands, it's that they know they're surrounded. I didn't yet. When the wind left entirely, the surface went from mirror to glass. You can hear the difference. Mirror water still speaks in whispers you call your own. Glass water holds its breath. In that held space, the first idea of tapping arrived. Not a sound, yet. Just the sense that anything with hands would learn the edge before trying the middle. There's a tone that comes off a canoe hull at night, when water touches it just right. It's not a thump. It's a small, rounded sound, the size of a knuckle testing a tabletop. I heard it first as chance, a tap, then the little gliss of a ripple returning to itself. The painter line, slack, drew a lazy S on the surface and straightened. The lamp inside the tent made a pale oval on the granite that didn't quite reach the shore. I kept my headlamp dark. The fire was only coals, and they didn't cast much authority beyond my boots. Another tap came, not hard, somewhere on the far side of the hull. At the edge of my sight, the painter line tugged and then eased. The canoe pivoted an inch or two, nosing a slightly new direction as if reintroducing itself to the water. I told myself it was a fish. Lake trout cruise shallow at night. Pike make their blunt moves close to shore. But the spacing of the taps corrected me. They had the unhurried cadence of footfalls, not on land, through water. Slow, deliberate, placed. There's a gait to someone moving thigh-deep that you can't mistake once you've watched it. The slight pause at each lift, the wider swing, the careful plant. The taps counted out that rhythm around me. The island is a circle when you let the light be. The dark held its own circumference at the edge of my camp, beyond a ring of water that wasn't mine. The sound came from that ring, 3 feet out from rock, moving clockwise. Tap, pause, tap. The painter made a faint throat-clearing sound as tension and slack traded places. Every time the tap slid along the arc, the line acknowledged it, humming the way a string does when someone walks past a piano in a quiet room. I held my breath the way a kid holds it to hear the answer to a dare. The air smelled like wet hair, and not the animal kind. Shampoo mostly gone, human mostly once. That's a stupid thing to say, and it's the exact truth. The next tap came at the north tip, where the drop is. I thought about a beaver. Beavers do their drama loud. They slap the water with a tail to alarm each other. Her, to scold you for your existence. This wasn't a slap. And an otter, they chatter and snort. They laugh like drunk men when they're in a mood. The lake kept its face. Whatever moved out there didn't mind me so much as it minded the circle of my light. I did a dangerous thing. I shifted my weight to get up, caught myself, and stayed seated. The urge to stand at the shoreline is the urge to hold a railing at a height. It makes a signal your body can't help but send. I wrapped my hands around my cup instead and pretended it was full. The taps rounded the corner and approached the hull from the side I could see. I looked without looking, eyes not on the surface, but taking peripheral inventory. The canoe slid an inch away as if someone pushed it lightly with their palm. The painter twanged once, just an A-flat note I could feel in my teeth. The hull answered with the soft sound of skin meeting skin. It was obscene in its intimacy, because a boat is a body when you are in it, and that boat had been my body all day. There was a long moment of nothing. Then something like breath, not warm, not with the pressure you feel through nylon, but an exhale's rhythm, passed along the water's skin. Ripples traveled just close enough to kiss the granite at my boots, tiny, polite tongues. The taps resumed farther along. The circle was being drawn again, outside mine. I let the lamp in the tent be the only statement I made. I went to bed without ceremony. Zipper left with its practiced gap, stove cooled to silence. Shoes pointed inward in the vestibule the way my grandmother arranged them by habit, as if you encourage things to follow certain lines when you sleep. Lying on the pad, I listened to the painter line converse with the lake. A faint pluck, quiet. Another. The cadence sent sleep in and out like a tide. Every time my breathing evened out, the island found a way to remind me that circles can be shared without consent. Sometime later, how much, I won't pretend I know, the taps ceased and a different sound replaced them. We tea on rock. Not slapping, not the noisy suction of a seal climb. More like 5 small dripping sounds at once, placed in a fan, then again, a foot or two to the right. If I'd been braver or dumber, I would have put my eyes to the mesh. I didn't. Courtesy. Pact. We each kept our rings. The wet sounds explored the edges where my light failed. The low lip of the island glistened in my periphery, and I got the sharp, childish sense of fingers being counted without me. The last sound before sleep took more of me than I meant to give was a tiny clink. The aluminum thwart in the canoe speaking when the hull shifted, the way metal does when a weight transfers. It said nothing dramatic. It said I am here and someone is with me and I am being asked a question I won't answer. Dawn flattened everything that had seemed dimensional. The lake went from black to graphite to a hard white blue. The pines wore beads of water like glass buttons along their lowest branches. I stepped out and the granite took my boot sound and carried it around the island like a gossip. The canoe floated exactly where I'd left it, bow yawed toward the north tip as if interested. The painter line arced with a wet shine on one side, dry on the other, as though only a half of it had been pulled and set again. It took time for my eyes to pick out what they were looking at. The rock had warmed just enough to be drying at the edges. Drier patches make witnesses. At intervals all the way around the low lip of the island, above the lapping line by 6-8 inches, there were shapes darker than the rest, fans that could have been made by a hand pressed lightly and lifted, then the drips trailing away the way water does when it remembers fingers. The spacing was wrong for hands and wrong for any four-legged thing. Some were narrow, as if made by something with long, fine digits, some broader, sloppy with water. But the pattern made an arc, then another, and wherever the granite bumped outward or caved in, the marks adjusted as if their owner had walked where there was no walking, just because my island was a circle and circles invite pursuit. I knelt to touch one. The rock was cool and a little rough. The wetness felt like lake. It smelled clean, which is to say like nothing. A relief and not. I looked for something to blame that was honest to the place. Beavers don't climb rock for curiosity. When they do, they smear with tails and track mud and they leave chew. Otters haul out sure and leave slides and scats that smell like fish and musk. They have the decency to be loud about it. Muskrats keep to reeds and build. These marks came to where my light had ended and turned back, polite as a neighbor who won't step into a room you haven't invited them into. The canoe had small new scuffs on the paint that didn't look like rock, thin, shallow arcs, almost parallel, near the waterline on the offside. The thwart that had clinked showed a bead of water cupped in the depression where the bolt head sits, a bead that wouldn't survive more than a minute of wind. There hadn't been a minute of wind. I coiled the painter in on itself and found 10 inches of the rope nearest the bow wetter than the rest, the waterline stopping cleanly instead of fading, as if a hand had grasped there and squeezed. It's a cheap magic trick telling yourself a story you can live with. I tried all the easy ones. A family of otters, moving social, curious about my ring of light, pushed at my hull, climbed for a better look, left their polite handprints and went. A beaver, steady, non-committal, used the hull as a convenient rest while it considered my island and found it uninteresting. A muskrat did math on the current against the painter and solved it with a scoot of its paw. I tried to hear the tail slap I should have heard but didn't, to smell the musk I should have smelled but didn't. The water was too cold for people. A swim last night would have been a dare I wouldn't have taken. Survival time in the sats. At sort of lake, in September, is a short clock. I have looked up those numbers since, and I wish I hadn't. I kept finding the same one. Not long, not hours, and the circling had taken hours. The other part of the pack chimed in, tidy as a bell. I had not asked a question. I hadn't swept the headlamp into the water. I hadn't called out. I had kept my light inside my ring and let the lake decide how to be curious. That courtesy was returned. The taps were patient, the exploration exact. Whatever it was that counted my circumference or my restraint, it didn't cross into the middle. It erased itself, as water does, leaving only the suggestion of a shape your brain fills with whatever it knows. And I know boats, and I know hands, and those were the two instruments that played a call and response all night. That knowledge sits wrong and right at the same time in a way I can't adjust. I put the fire out thoroughly, boiled, stirred, flattened until the granite felt like granite again. I backed the canoe in, climbed with the slow careful of someone being watched even when they're not, and untied the painter only when the bow had room to turn. I wanted to drag the hull onto the rock and let it dry in theater sun, to dismiss the night by changing the tool. Instead, I kept to the rule I didn't know I'd made here. Don't make your boat into a bell again. Coil the rope dry in your lap. Let nothing touch water you aren't in. On the paddle out, a loon rose beside me and flew low, its wings beating water into syllables, and for a second I hated the lake for its joy. The feeling went with the next stroke. Joy is part of the fee. Fear is too. On the second portage, a frog made its spring-loaded leap from a rock so near my foot I flinched, and the sound it made hitting the pond surface matched the smallest of the night taps so precisely my throat closed. It wasn't a sign, it was a remind. Dare of how the world shares textures and leaves you to decide which ones you're going to knit into a story. At home, I found myself tap-checking things. The bathtub's enamel when I turned the faucet off, the aluminum lip of a pot when water cooled, the side of the washing machine when the cycle changed. I'd never noticed how many small noises in a house are the lake asking for your attention. The rule I carry from that island is a quiet one, and I break it sometimes because I am lazy. Don't leave a craft half in, half out. Either beach it high and let it sleep with you, or let it float well away without a taut line. Don't make your camp a circle so clean it invites a circle back. Leave a gap in your light. Offer water a lane. It sounds like superstition because it is. It also sounds like respect. I don't know what touched my hull or climbed the rock to the exact edge of my light and not an inch more. I don't know how to weigh courtesy when it comes from the dark, but I know the feel of being measured. That island made a tape of my patience and wrapped it around me twice. I gave what I could. Quiet, stillness, the permission of not looking, and I came away with the sound of knuckles on aluminum in my head, which is a kind of souvenir you can hear even when the lake is a sink and the loon is the neighbor's car door. The pact held, the rings touched without crossing. That should be enough. Sometimes it almost is. Lookouts smell like weather that forgot to leave. Creosote baked into timber, mouse droppings that have their own dry, peppery note, the ghost of ozone from storms that used to park here and scrape their knuckles on the roof. The last bend of the old service road had washed out years ago, so I shouldered the pack and took the switchbacks on foot, boards nailed into dirt at old intervals, each step a little elastic with rot. By the time the stair column came into view, the light had gone from brass to something thinner. The tower stood on stilts bolted into rock, a 1930s cab square as a punctuation mark, glass on all four sides and a tight belt of catwalk all the way around like a narrow thought. At the base, a metal plate listed the agency, a year, and names people had scratched through with knives to add their own. The metal was cold enough to stick fingers. Up the stairs, the land fell away in neat slices. I could hear the pines making their long, dry whisper down in the drainages, even with no wind up here. Every landing had its own pitch when I stepped on it, as if the tower were tuned, low at the bottom, higher near the top where the fasteners were closer together. My breath came out in little plumes and got stolen by the first height with enough dignity to keep it. The door to the cab dragged on its hinges in a way that made a sound I can still feel in my teeth. Inside, the Osborne Firefinder, a brass wheel and sighting hardware on a stout table, still mounted over a map ring yellowed to tea. Thumbtacks marched around the perimeter in colors that meant something once. A ledger sat open on a shelf near the window, curled pages gritty with blown dust. The last hand was tight and plain. Storm logs. Lightning strikes tallied into a column. Barometer notes I can't help but read as personality. Falling hard. Flattened. The dates weren't yesterday. The last take entry. A summer of the big fire year everyone references now like a shared memory. The page ended with shutters closed, trap latched, leaving at 21:10, and then a long scrawl into blank like the pencil had kept moving while the hand decided what not to write. There was an old VHF radio angled at the corner, green paint worn to gray along the knobs. The coax cable ran through a cracked insulator out to a whip that still stood lightning bent on the roofline. It shouldn't have done anything but remember. The panel showed no battery. A coil of wire was taped to a shelf with a note in blunted pencil. Do not trust. I had my own weather band handheld in the pack because the plan was simple. Sleep up here, catch first light, look at the world like a map pretending not to be. The view made that lie easy. Ranges laid like the backs of sleeping animals, plumes of fog in the valleys, a reservoir catching the last of the day and holding it like an old coin. I set the sleeping pad on the side where the floor was least crowned. In place of a tent zipper, I had a door latch, and by habit I left it just shy of seated, the thickness of a nail's width, a courtesy gap that didn't make sense here and still felt required. I wedged a stick in the trap door to the stairs instead of latching it. I don't know when those behaviors stopped being rituals and became rules. The little lamp I carried made a warm center in a room too used to blue. Moths materialized from nowhere and then somehow remembered there was nowhere for them to go, and settled. I traced names in the ledger, people without faces, one cartoon of a lightning bolt, a hi mom in a hand that made me suddenly kind toward strangers. The night moved in like it had paid for the privilege. The glass pinged as it contracted. Far below, a single late car found the last of the gravel and then decided against it. When the dark up here gets real, it's like someone tilted the whole mountain into it and stopped just before you fell. I shut the lamp. The cab settled and ticked. With the view gone, the tower was only a room above everything. It felt, I'll admit, like a good place to be responsible. Above the world, watching it, safe in a geometry that promised 4 corners and 1 door. I told myself I'd earned the perspective. What I didn't know yet was that watching isn't the only transaction a tower offers. The word has another meaning. The watch as in time. The watch as in a shift someone takes so that another can sleep, as in something that counts without needing you. Late, the tower found new sounds, not wind. The catwalk boards made the soft, small creak of something settling one plank at a time, a ripple of pressure that traveled the perimeter and was gone. I listened the way I do when the tent wants to behave like a drum, letting each noise define itself and pass without getting a name. The handheld weather radio on my pack strap did its loops. Marine reports from far lakes coded forecasts in a paneled voice, the fast syllables of weather alerts from a county I wasn't in. Out of boredom, and because I was up, I put my hand on the old VHF and turned the knob to feel the satisfying physical click. I expected nothing. Static spilled like frying hair, dry and insistent. I smiled despite myself. Ghosts make ordinary noises all the time. Static turned thoughtful. A rough carrier came and went. Somewhere out there, a repeater woke and slept. Then a voice, sanded down by too many miles of air and old equipment, recited numbers in a rhythm you get used to if you eavesdrop on the practical. 471 ni. Na .3 north, 12134.1 west. A breath. 0207. A second breath, close to the mic in the way someone gets when they're working late and forget there's a world beyond the mouthpiece. Then, copy? The coordinates weren't exotic. They were my hill, not my general hill. Exact. I had the topo ring right there. I didn't want to look at it the same way you don't want to confirm a reflection in a dark window after you've decided not to see it. I looked anyway. The map's marginalia had the rounded numbers, the minutes and decimals that matched. They lined right up with the Osborne's arrow, the circle that liked to pretend it could address the whole forest as if it were a single body. I did not key the mic. I did not say copy, because I've taught myself not to answer when the dark tries to use my words. The voice waited with the small patience of someone doing a job the same way for a long time. 0207, it said again, softer. The old speaker cone made everything sound like it came through a mouthful of old pennies. The building made a crackling reply of its own as the glass and timber adjusted to nothing I could name. Below, the pines held very still, black combs against an even black, no wind at their level. Up here, though, the corner a foot to my left cooled hard enough to bump my shoulder like someone had leaned on the frame and then leaned away. I told myself it was a weather station test, a beacon resetting itself. Captain Obvious in some county shack pinging coordinates to see if the old repeater could still get out, and 2 digits in a time that meant shift change for a crew who'd never know I heard them. The time on my wrist said 0158. That felt like more than coincidence and less than fate. At 0205, the radio coughed and found a second voice, this one thinner, farther off, describing lightning like column inches. Strike 2 ridges over, it said, then numbers I didn't have context for like inventory. I pictured a kid whose voice hadn't finished itself yet, grave with responsibility. I tried to make it a recording. I tried to make it anything but now. The trapdoor under my stick bumped once. The stick clicked as it shifted in its notch. Not a breath later, it lifted hard, up against the underside of the hatch, wood on wood, like a palm set just so and pushed. The hatch lifted enough for the latch to ring against the frame and fell, slamming the boards in a way the screws argued about. Instinct got me into a crouch I pretended was about balance. 0207, the radio said in that first voice, dependable as a clock. At 0207 exactly, the hatch came up and dropped again, harder, the sound pulling my stomach up after it. The catwalk boards to my right gave a tidy chorus of squeaks like a person transferring weight from one foot to the other. Below, the tree crowns didn't so much as gesture. There's a kind of wind that lives only around structures, a local weather the building invents. This wasn't that. This was a pressure that had chosen the border of the room as a path. The ledger, on its shelf, lifted a corner as if looking at me. That's how it seemed, and I know that's how it seemed. The radio went clean again, a wash of emptiness as though the repeater had shut its eyes. I could hear my own breath. I could hear a moth tapping at the glass in patient embarrassment. I felt the extra space in the dark at my back, the larger room beyond the room a tower makes when it has to remember air on all sides. I didn't speak. My entire job in that minute had one line: don't say copy. The quiet that followed lasted the exact length of a note would. Someone had struck something with a mallet. 2, 3, 4. Then the tower did what towers do. It carried the little sounds around itself once. One boarding groan to the left, a click ahead, another to the right, like footsteps that had nothing to do with legs. I went from standing to sitting on the pad without memory of the middle. 0208. 0209. The old watch hand on my wrist clicked like a cheap metronome through the next half hour. The radio offered nothing more. I left it on until I fell asleep in a posture you only see on people on buses. There was no safe posture to pretend otherwise. Morning was the kind that mistakes kindness for explanation. Needles glowed. The air had that pre-fire safety smell of summer, even out of season. The cab's corners wore tiny crescents of moth bodies at the glass, and I counted them like that was a job. I went to the trap door first. The stick I had used as a wedge wasn't where I had left it. Not by much. An inch to the right and turned 90 degrees like someone had gotten their foot under it. Lifted, lost interest, set it back with a different idea of tidy. The hatch edges wore new scuffs into the old paint, bright wood showing like a shy body part. The latch had the round bruise mark of a ring of metal that had kissed it harder than my hand could have made it without intention. When I stood on the catwalk, the boards gave the same little squeaks they'd made in the night, each plank announcing me as if rehearsing. The old VHF sat inert, the way it should have been when I arrived. I traced the coax with my fingers from the back of the radio to the insulator at the roof. In daylight, it was more honest. Cracked jacketing, spider webbing where plastic had turned to paint. A feral green with age. The back plate to the radio's battery compartment was gone. There was nowhere obvious a hidden cell could have lived. That's not evidence of anything. Either way. The Osborne's ring gleamed, polite. The topo's corner had lifted itself in the night and dried into a curl that wasn't there before. On the ledger shelf, grit had been moved in a little half-moon, as if a fingertip had made a lazy notch while someone waited. That someone could have been me. Dust lies. Brains do too. I did the rational. I did it to the point of rudeness. Radios catch skip. Temperature inversions bend signals weird. Forestry folks still run drills on lonely channels, practicing the same phrases people used before the fire years rearranged funding and the world forgot to staff towers like this. Old architectures hold on to new weather. Pressure differentials can make doors bang like they mean it. A gust goes to sleep in the tree crowns but wakes to mischief when it hits a box on stilts. Every explanation had enough truth in it to build a lifeboat if you didn't look down to see the holes. I stared at the time on my watch until it looked like a word repeated too often and lost meaning. 0207 went with me down the stairs, one landing at a time, each a little higher on the scale than the last. On the ground, the world felt appropriately heavy. A dead branch gave way under my boot with a little argument. A jay did a bad hawk and then got bored of its own theater. None of it explained the sense of being counted. The ledger rode in my lap feel, even though I left it where it belonged. I read the last entry again because I couldn't not. Shutters closed, trap latched, leaving at 21:10. In the margin, a pencil had traced a circle around a time. Just a circle, no label. It could have been anyone. It could have been a coffee ring that dried tidy. I didn't write it down anywhere else. I didn't take a picture. The only thing I carried out physically was my pack and whatever a sound does to a person's idea of time when it arrives, right when promised. Rules harden when you are alone in rooms made of edges. I learned two from the tower that I am still bad at keeping. The first, don't give your attention to devices that can name you while you sleep. Radios, phones, even the stupid little weather band that has saved me twice. If it can say where you are out loud and what time it is, you've invited the idea of being scheduled. The second, don't sleep at the center of a map unless you mean to be someone else's reference point. Summits, lookouts, promontories, places with rings drawn around them by people you will never meet, are also places that measure you back. I still go. I still put myself on circles. But I do it with the door cracked a hair. Not to invite, not to be brave. Just to keep the pact honest. Courtesy, returned in the smallest denomination. At home for a while, Joe 207 had a gravity. If I woke and saw it, I would lie there as if a hatch had just bumped and then settle, because nothing else asked me to move. Sometimes I would catch the fridge motor kick on and hear the cheap vibrato of an old speaker cone in it. Once, walking past an open stairwell in my building, a draft lifted the sliver of carpet runner on a step and let it fall. The sound it made was exactly wood kissing wood after weight has left it. It didn't mean anything. It meant everything. That's how it is with these nights. I didn't say copy, and nothing else asked me to. There's a version of this story where I keyed the mic and a voice I know, or don't, answered. Or where the hatch opened and something set a hand on the edge and agreed with me about the weather. That's not this version. This version is a ledger that ends in a year with too much fire, an old radio that worked until it didn't, a door that got pushed when the world below in the trees stayed asleep. The tower kept its watch. I kept mine. I left when the sun made the Osborne's brass look like a thing you weren't supposed to touch anymore, and I haven't been back. If I ever am, I'll probably do the rude thing and leave the radio off. Or I'll forget and turn it because turning things is what hands do, and I'll listen to someone far away tell me exactly where I am and what time it will be when something taps the underside of the world to say, now. I came into the meadow from a saddle where the last Krumholtz pines twisted themselves into the suggestion of trees and then gave up. Beyond them, the slope settled into a high, shallow bowl that collected light the way a bell collects sound, thin at the edges, deep in the middle. It was late August, a cold year up high. The asters kept their color, but the grasses had gone to a pale, dry music under boot. The ground was a quilt of sedge and low willow and flaked stone, the kind of flat, platy schist that stacks itself without your permission if you kick it wrong. Someone had camped here before. You can feel that as much as see it. The flatness that doesn't match the rest of the slope, the way the soil beneath the duff compacts into a firmness your heel names platform, even if there isn't a scrap of plastic or cord to confirm it. I chose the downwind edge of the bowl and set the tent with its back to the slope, a token against weather that didn't look interested in arriving. Thunderheads were out over the far range having their last argument of the season. The wind came in tidy, periodic sighs that combed the grasses east to west and then stopped to think. It was the stops I came for. I'd heard something once, told in the shrugging way climbers tell you about a rock that has a good ring, if you hit it. Singers, they called it, like objects had jobs. I'd made a note and let it sit for years, and then here I was, laying a pause. Down on a platform other people's backs had made flat. I went through the familiar motions with hands that felt more deliberate than usual. Guy lines snug but not taut enough to sing. Stakes set deep enough to hold but not so deep they'd turn into tuning forks. Titanium spoon wrapped in a bandana before it went into the pot, because I have learned the hard way that metal wants to be a bell if you give it a chance. The zipper stayed 3 teeth shy of closed. Headlamp on warm, lowest setting turned inward. I didn't whistle. I didn't say my name to the sky and see if it came back with an echo. The meadow had a border that was more of a suggestion than a line. Scree took over where the bowl turned toward the ridge, and the plates up there made a language of their own. Tile on tile, the thin clatter of old dinnerware when a house leans after a truck goes by. The air smelled like crushed pennywort, and stone warmed past polite. When the wind crossed and calmed, a noise came up from the earth that felt a little like what your finger does on the rim of a glass when you've had one too many and decide to test the physics. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even quite sound at first. More like a thread got pulled through the place, and your ears learned a new stitch by accident. I ate fast because dusk in high bowls turns fast from gold to the blue that lies about temperature. The stove's steady roar made a pocket of authority, and when I turned it off, the quiet stepped back in like a person reclaiming their seat after a long, polite interruption. For a few minutes, the wind stayed lazy. Then it left. In that hush, the meadow rang. A single faint line, not so much note as intention. I told myself 100 ways to explain it before I let myself simply hear it. Frost-loosened plates flexing, distant rockfall finding an overtoned match in the flats, my own head inventing a halo. The line faded when the first small breath of wind returned, as if the place could only sing when it wasn't also busy breathing. The rules felt necessary here in a way that wasn't superstition so much as good manners. Don't tighten what doesn't need tuning. Don't introduce rhythm to a place that already has one. Don't take a tone home even if it offers itself. I wrote those in my head the way you do when your hands are too full to get the notebook. I lay down with them and listen to the meadow make the kind of promise you can only hear when nothing else is promising louder. The first clear ring came when the last bird in the bowl, something small with a disinterested tick of a call, decided the temperature wasn't a conversation. The wind went from light to no one, and a tone rose from somewhere I couldn't point to, as thin and exact as a filament. If you've ever stood near an old bell when someone tips it to test the clapper, you know how a large thing can make a small sound that still rearranges your ribs. This wasn't large. This was a meadow's worth of glass drink rims being touched by nothing in particular, one at a time, in a circle that traveled faster than feet could. I lay as still as the nylon would let me, and counted the breath between the end of one ring and the start of the next. 11, then 9, then a long, unreasonable 14, which made my body lean toward expectation. The guy line at the windward corner vibrated the way fishing line does when a trout refuses to be defined as weight and calls itself idea. I wrapped my hand around the loop inside the tent to stop it from speaking my name out loud. The spoon, buried in cloth in the pot, answered anyway with the smallest ask of a sound, a suggestion of metal, thinking about being useful. It's hard to describe the way attention moves when sound arrives from below you. Your ears are animals that learn to look. They want a direction. The ring offered none. When the wind grazed the grass, the tone slipped under it. When the wind its mouth, the tone stepped into the space like someone making sure you weren't asleep before they tried your door. I could feel it in my teeth before my ears would admit to it. Not hostile, not kind. A stranger inspecting a boundary and deciding what courtesy requires. Something in the scree above the bowl clicked like flatware in a drawer. Not a tumble, not gravity's sentence. One, then a pause that a person would call thought, then another, smaller, as if someone corrected for weight. The meadow rang again, a hair higher, like someone moved their finger a fraction on a glass rim. The hair on my arms made the same quiet argument it makes in thunderstorms. I found absolutely nothing to do with my hands that wasn't stupid. The headlamp stayed on my chest. The zipper did not travel. My throat tried on a hum without consulting me, and I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to stop it. Don't give a place your pitch. If silence is a pact, tone is too. The spoon, which I had more than adequately smothered, asked again. It's not that I heard it. It's that the thought of it made exactly the smallest noise a spoon makes in a pot. I lifted the lid with 2 fingers and tucked the whole thing deeper into the vestibule, thinking of sound as light. You keep the bright inside your wall. You don't make a porch. The meadow rang again in answer to nothing I had done, and the guy line gave a heart pluck so light I would have missed it if my finger hadn't been resting there. What makes something feel watched isn't always eyes. Sometimes it's the sequence of small correctives in the world around you. The way a tone arrives right when you've decided to exhale. The way a click in rock mirrors the length of your swallow. The ring climbed half a step and held until my jaw ached. A moth bounced off the fly as if embarrassed to be part of this. In the lull that followed, the scree spoke not as a spill but as a rearrangement, flat on flat, then a tiny shift, then nothing. I pictured a pair of hands, but not in the human sense, more like the end of a process the meadow had practiced before there were hands to name it. At some point I slept, because I was suddenly woke by that peculiar full-body flinch you get when your dream gives you the wrong gravity. The tone was gone. Wind stroked the grass in a pattern I could diagram. The meadow had become a place again instead of an instrument. I listened for the returning ring until I fell asleep a second time, and if the meadow rang again, it did it in the part of night that steals from your memory first. Part 3. The Aftermath. Lingering impact. Morning held its breath the way places do when they've made their point and aren't sure if you're the type to hear it. Dew had stitched glass beads along every blade of sedge. The tent sparkled like a thing too expensive for me. When I unzipped the door, leaving the gap I leave out of habit, as if the tent might get offended if I pretended it sealed, I saw the first stack, a column of flat stones the height of my hip, each plate laid with a patience that did not belong to fatigue. It sat 5 feet off the vestibule, canted a degree toward me in a way balance shouldn't allow. Then the second behind my left shoulder, then a third that I hadn't seen because it used the shadow of the first like a curtain. Turning slowly, not because I thought it mattered, but because it felt wicked to move anything fast, I counted 9 in a loose ring around the tent. Each had a wedge of smaller flakes placed between larger plates as if to tune the column. Each had the top stone angled slightly inward, like a nod. In the vestibule, my pot lid lay where I'd left it, but the spoon was not in cloth. It had been pressed into the dirt just beyond the footprint, handle down, bowl up, the handle buried at a neat slant so measured I thought of a protractor. The bowl caught Mornin' G-light, and gave it back in a line that aimed not at the nearest stack but at a point between 2, a corridor I hadn't noticed until my eyes obeyed the spoon. I did the child's thing first. I looked for footprints. The soil here, thready and tough with roots, doesn't take prints clean the way snow does. It resists telling stories. Still, I expected scuffs where stones had been dragged or set down. There was nothing obvious. In places where the plates had been taken from a patch of scree, that patch looked less messy than it should. Clean edges where there should be crumbs, lichen unbroken along breaks that should have sheared it. I told myself something sensible, that the stacks existed before I arrived, and sleep made me generous in the morning with credit for things I had missed. I considered photographers, I considered pranksters, I considered a crew of ultra-runners who camped light and amused themselves with pointless labor at 3 a.m., moving like cats so their shoes said nothing to the ground. Marmots don't stack stone, pikas carry grass and kiss it into hay under boulders. They don't make architecture. The spoon undid me more than the columns, and that felt wrong and exactly right. A spoon is a private object, intimate in the way simple things are when they spend a lot of time near your mouth. To find it doing geometry in the dirt, bowl up like an ear, handle buried at an angle that meant something I wasn't equipped to measure, made a different door in me open. Leave no trace says dismantle cairns that aren't there for navigation. This is the part where I tell you I knocked them down and felt righteous. I didn't. I'm not proud of that, and I'm also not ashamed. I have a different pack that sometimes pulls harder than policy. Every story I've told you ends with me not touching the arrangements the night makes unless they are mine to clean. The stacks stood up. I said. 80 as a hand you trust. While I boiled water and stared like a tourist at a cathedral he was sure would be smaller than the photos, the ring didn't return while the stove burned. When I shut it down, a line of tone lasted exactly as long as the last plume of steam off the cup and then quit before I could pretend it meant anything. I pulled the spoon out in one motion and filled the hole immediately, not to cover anything up, but because not filling it felt like leaving an agreement hanging open. The handle had a crescent of damp on it where the ground had gripped it. It smelled like iron and old rain. I rewrapped it in the bandana, though that seemed silly in daylight. I could feel the urge rise, the childish need to test the stacks with a palm to prove they were as precarious as they looked. I didn't touch them. I packed with a competence that made me look like a more serious version of myself and kept glancing at the angles the tops chose. Not quite pointing at me, not quite away. The spoon's angle had been constant enough that when I thought about it later, at home, I drew a protractor line and guessed at degrees, 20-something, close to the Earth's tilt, which is the kind of pattern hunting that makes you sound like someone you don't want to have dinner with. I don't know. I didn't measure. I didn't want to be measured back. On the hike out, the meadow rang once when the wind paused. I stopped and waited for the pitch to shift, and it didn't. It held, one clean thread, until a breath touched the grasses and the world went back to its larger noises. The stacks would fall in the next blow, or stand until the first hard snow used them to draw drift lines. Either way, they'd no longer be mine by nightfall. That's the better end of most of these things. I walked until trees resumed and felt the relief of trunks. Branches make a different sort of pact, clarity over tone. In the city for a month, I heard rings that didn't exist every time the refrigerator compressor cut out, or the heater died mid-cycle, or the fan in the bathroom ticked against itself in the first T-minute. I dampened things. I learned how to wedge a folded napkin under a vibrating pan before it cooled. I stopped leaving metal on metal in my sink overnight. The rule from that meadow is stingy and practical. Don't make your camp into an instrument, and if a place already is one, don't try to play along. Damp your lines. Muffle your spoons. Don't hum. Don't complete a circle someone else started. I can live with my version. Thermal expansion, Aeolian trickery, a night owl with a habit of moving stone, the stupid hope of a human brain making symphonies from plinks. I can live with it because the alternative is admitting I slept in a room the size of a meadow, and someone came in, not hostile and not kind, rearranged furniture I hadn't noticed was furniture, and left a note in the language of angles using my spoon. The day makes that sound less like a confession and more like a story. At night, when the furnace quiets, I hear the filament again and wait the length of a breath to see if it will climb. It doesn't. The pact holds as well in apartments as on bowls of grass, it turns out. I keep my metal quiet. I leave my doors a little open. I don't touch what arranges itself. And sometimes when the wind stops absolutely and the building does that big soft answer it does, I think of plates on plates and a spoon in dirt and the audacity of a place having a pitch at all, and I feel, briefly, less alone. Coastal trees bend like they've been listening too long. The Sitka spruce on that headland leaned toward the ocean as if someone had pulled their attention out and left it hovering 50 yards offshore. I parked at the end of a logging spur that had given up pretending to be a road and took the last mile on foot. Duff soft as felt, salal grabbing at calves, sword ferns rattling like bead curtains when you brush them wrong. The trail stepped down to a pocket cove where drift logs lay stacked like lumber, a board God forgot to move. The beach was a hash of pebbles and shell and kelp knots, the kind of place where the tide writes with a different alphabet every 6 hours. The dog ranged in dignified arcs, never farther than the last drift log, the tags on his collar making a music I can still hear if I shut my eyes. 2 bright notes close together, always a little apologetic. I don't say his name outside after dark anymore. Back then it was already a habit that felt like courtesy more than fear. Whistling is just a question you hurl into night. I was learning not to ask questions the dark could answer. Fog was already staging when I dropped the pack on the high side above the rack line. It came in off the water like someone turning down a dimmer. The horizon closed its eyes. The headland across became a suggestion. The flat gray above us thickened until it felt like ceiling. I pitched the tent tucked against a log so big it had its own weather. Zipper left 3 teeth open out of reflex. I set the lamp inside, warm and low, to keep the nylon honest. The stove hissed into that private authority fire has. Dinner tasted like smoke and iodine, and that metallic taste ocean air gets when your tongue starts to believe it's rusted. When the fog lays down hard, it doesn't just change what you can see, it plays games with sound. The buoy bell out there had been doing its sleepy 2-note long sways all afternoon, the clonk so slow and sure you could set a heart by it. As the fog thickened, the bell went weird, sharper, then farther, louder than behind me, as if it had decided to walk the beach under the salal. The surf, too, lost its clean, breathable rhythm and settled into a low rolling like someone moving furniture in the apartment above yours when you don't know you have neighbors. I checked the tide chart with the same superstition you check a lock twice. High ebb past midnight, the kind that hugs rock and then lets go suddenly. I set a thin stick and a stone at the last wet line to see what climbed overnight. The dog nosed the stone, sighed, and lay with his head on my boot. The smell of rotting eelgrass hung in ropes along the high line. It's not a bad smell if you grew up near it, but it makes honesty out of a place. There's no way to pretend you aren't near a body of water that carries and keeps. The fog moved in lanes through the pines above us, gray rivers and dark branches. I could feel the temperature notch down with each thicker set. The hair at the base of my skull started to bead with dew that turned to a thin chill under the hood. I kept the headlamp on my chest, light warm and pointed at my knees. The night held its breath the way it does when it's deciding what it is. I told myself the same old bedtime story. Thermal inversion, ducting, diffraction, because physics is the polite way to talk to yourself in weather. It helps until it doesn't. What I remember before it shifted is simple. The dog's 2-note tag music settling to stillness, the buoy bell clonk pulling into a sleepy distance, and that feeling I get in fog sometimes that I am being cataloged, height, heat, outline, not unfriendly, but not mine to interpret either. It started with my name said kindly from the wrong direction, the sort of way someone who knows you uses it when they're about to ask for a small favor. No edge, no question mark, just the note that says you're seen. It came from behind my left shoulder, close enough that the tiny hairs there bowed under the idea of breath. I turned the smallest amount in my bag, the way you do when you want to make sure you didn't invent it with your own jaw moving in the hood. The dog lifted his head but didn't rumble. That was almost worse. The second time it came from farther out, on the water side. Same warmth, same almost laugh in the last syllable. The exact cadence people use when they found me in a crowd. The fog made the lamp on my knees a little sun. Beyond it was gray that ate everything. I didn't reach for the zipper. I didn't speak back. Names or doors. That's what my brain offered, flat and unhelpful. I kept my breath even, like I was pretending to be asleep. There's a way sound behaves in fog that's more than just dampening. It's a double life sound. It walks around corners and then shows up behind you wearing your friend's coat. The buoy bell hit a familiar note, and then a high, wrong overtone like a fork on a plate, and my name arrived again from both sides at once, behind me and across the drift logs near the water. Same voice. Same tender, almost embarrassed delivery, a fraction out of sync the way stereo will go when a wire is pulled but not quite. The dog stood, stretched, shook the collar once, those 2 bright notes like punctuation, and then he went into the fog like someone had called him with a tone he recognized better than anything I had. I put my palm down on the sleeping bag and the nylon, ridiculous, felt like the only thing keeping me plotted. There are all sorts of wrongs you can let happen before you act. This wasn't even a wrong, it was a quest. I didn't ask questions at night, I didn't answer them either, but the dark had used my name and then used his silence. Every habit leaned forward and thoughtlessly about to break itself. The voice came again, but the sound this time had a small quality I can't forget. The moist whisper of someone about to say something longer, and then deciding against it, the inhale you only hear when you're too close to a face. It brushed the conch of my ear inside the hood. That shouldn't be possible. Fog bathes everything, yes, but it damps edges. It doesn't sharpen them. A drop formed on the fine hair there and rolled cold along my jaw. I kept my teeth shut so my mouth wouldn't make a shape the night could see. Dog tags jingled left, then right. Not running, no frantic pattern, just that steady trot he does when he's checking a perimeter, except the perimeter kept moving. The jingling was always just at the edge of where my lamp failed. I made the mistake of lifting the headlamp a fraction, not to cast a beam so much as to raise its line. The droplets in the fog turned into a million eyes at once, and I lowered it quick like I'd flashed someone and owed an apology. I broke the pact in the smallest way. I said, "Hey," soft, the word you use when you're trying both to reassure and to call. No names, no whistles. The fog absorbed it like a small animal. The voice answered with my name and a laugh this time, a tiny vanished thing my mother used when she'd been looking for me in a store and found me in the wrong aisle. My name elongated by half a heartbeat in the middle, the way only she did. My skin did the hot then cold of someone walking over your grave, as my grandmother used to put it. The dog's jingling tags went silent. The buoy rang once and fell into itself. I heard, distinct, close, the sound of wet weeds parted under a careful step, but not water. Not the slap of a foot leaving a tide pool. More like eelgrass lifted and set down by hands. I thought of him nose deep in whatever line of smell the ocean draws in fog for creatures smarter about it than we are, and I pictured him trotting between rocks he couldn't see, confident because dogs have better sensors. I pictured a channel there that didn't exist when the fog wasn't here. I pictured a path drawn in physics and patience. Those pictures didn't help. I put my hand on the zipper and took it away. Courtesy, I told myself. It felt like superstition, and it felt like survival. The voice didn't ask again. It didn't need to. It waited near the tent and away at the waterline, both places where I would be tempted to step. Then it went farther, as if walking away to see if I would follow. I didn't. I fell asleep the way you fall asleep in a car you don't trust with someone you love at the wheel, one muscle at a time like a negotiation. Sometime after the fog's edge had soaked everything not under nylon and the buoy bell had learned a new patience, the dog came back like he'd been gone 10 minutes instead of hours. The tags announced him first. 2 bright notes just outside the tent door. He breathed a damp breath into the gap I leave in the zipper and exhaled the ocean through it. When I let him in, he was decorated, thin ribbons of sea lettuce tucked into the ruff behind one ear, a slick twist of eelgrass looped somehow through the ring of his collar like someone had threaded it. His coat was cool and smelled like old water. His paws were dust dry, not damp, not sandy, dry. I knelt with the lamp low and cupped one paw, then the next. Pads clean, the faint dusty polish he gets from trails, not the dark grit the beach gives. Belly fur dry, ear tips wet. The eelgrass on his collar was wet in a way that leaves a line on your fingers, but the fur beneath had its dry loft, the curve that collapses into clumps the moment it meets brine. He yawned in my face like an apology. I whispered, "Good boy," and didn't say his name. It wasn't punishment, it was the rule. Don't pin anything down in fog with a name unless you want to keep it there with you forever. We slept eventually. The fog pressed the tent until the nylon got that newspaper feel to it, and the buoy did its own version of breathing. On, pause, off. Morning arrived only because the gray turned to a different kind of gray, and the birds decided life was worth announcing again. The stick and stone I had set at the last wetline were both moved 6 feet to the right and 2 feet closer to the logs. There was no sign of the tide having reached them. The beach had rearranged itself as beaches do. New ripple marks, new seam of periwinkle shells, a cluster of kelp bulbs where none had been. On a drift log above, even the high line, a scarf of sea lettuce hung over the bark in a neat drape, still wet enough to shine. Gulls do that sometimes, I told myself. They drop their work everywhere. He had left no obvious footprints. That's not a surprise. Pebble beaches hide everything they don't care to share. Near the waterline, though, there were 3 prints I recognized as his, slightly deeper in the front where his weight rolls, the characteristic splay of the 2 outer toes. They were crisp, and then they weren't. They started at nothing and ended in glare like someone had pressed a stamp into water. That's the sort of sentence I'd make fun of in a story I didn't live in. I took my own tongue apart in my head for the poetry, and then stood there a long time hoping the tide would rewrite the beach while I watched, so I didn't halt. Be to take the memory home. Explanations are a mercy and a trap. I tried them on one by one as I made coffee. He found a kelp bed high and dry and rolled just so, the way dogs do, and missed the wet. He walked drift to drift, bridging the damp parts, and his paws stayed dry while his ear dipped here, his collar there. He found a seep, not the sea. and it had sea lettuce from some child's game draped on it long after the tide left, and he shoved his face in because dogs are all nose. That, at least, is true. I cupped the eelgrass loop and slipped it free, smoothing it on the log like ribbon. A line of salt dried on my fingers as the air moved. I licked at the habit to prove a point and tasted ocean. The part of me that wants to be decent to physics brought up ducting again. Sound trapped in temperature layers, voices carrying miles and arriving as if whispered in your ear. People talk on beaches at night. Laughter does that odd flattening, traveling as if it belongs to your group when it doesn't. The name could have belonged to someone else's somebody. The fog borrowed it on its way through. But I know the shape of my name when certain people say it. The fog returned it to me in two directions with the exact unshareable mid-syllable my mother put there, which is a mean trick for a visible phase of water to play. On the hike out, the dog heeled closer than usual. He cut me off twice on the bluff like he was worried I would decide to step where there was no step. When we hit the truck, he put his head on my knee the way he does after vet visits. In town, I washed the sea lettuce from his collar and found 2 grains of pale sand wedged under the ring that were not beach sand from that cove. The wrong color. Too fine. The kind from further south where the rivers still gift the coast. That's a detail I could have lived without noticing. I threw them away, then went into the trash and looked at them again, and then left them there. Since that night, I have a fog rule I don't break. I don't say names, not mine, not his, not yours if you're with me. I use clicks. I use a bowl tapped softly with a fingernail, 3 taps, time and again, and I let sound be a pattern I own, not a label the dark can borrow. I don't follow voices, and I don't raise the lamp above my knees. I keep 2 lights, the inside lamp steady and the headlamp low, so I can tell where the edges of my circle are without illuminating a road for something else. It sounds like superstition because it is. It sounds like courtesy because that's the shape I can stand to give it. I've tried to recreate the double direction thing in rooms with corners, with friends with a speaker hidden and another behind a door. It's never right. There's always the sense it comes in the clavicle somehow, that the sound has a source. In the fog that night, the sound didn't. It was me, named by 2 places at once, and asked politely to attend. I did. I attended by not answering. He came back from wherever physics gave him a walkway. We left no proof for anyone who needs it. That's part of the pact, too. At home now, when a marine layer pushes in and the city smells like wet concrete and distant ocean, the vents in my building breathe a stray breath against my ear and I stand up like someone said my name. I smile at myself for it and still check the dog. He watches the window like it could be a tide, then lies down with his head on my ankle as if to pin me in place. It's an arrangement I accept. The fog can keep whatever corridor it opened and closed that night. The only map I draw now is the little ring of warm light I make and the small set of sounds I own. That, and the 3 teeth on a zipper, and the way I only answer to the pact when I can live with what it might return,